All right, today we're stepping into a world that's right on the edge of complete collapse. We're going to unpack one of the most vivid and honestly intense prophecies in the book of Isaiah, specifically chapter 7, verses 17 through 25. It's just packed with these stark images and some pretty heavy warnings about what happens when trust is put in the wrong place. So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the initial declaration of judgment. Then we'll get into the wild metaphors. We're talking invading insects and something called a hired razor. And finally, we'll explore what this prophecy says the world will look like after all the devastation. Let's get into it. Okay, so the prophecy kicks off with a crystal clear statement. There's no ambiguity here. It says exactly who is coming and just how bad it's going to be. Right there in verse 17, the stage is set. This isn't just going to be a rough patch. The text says it'll be a time of suffering worse than anything the people have seen since the kingdom of Israel first split in two. And it points a finger directly at the agent of all this pain, the king of Assyria. Now, this is absolutely crucial to understand. The prophecy frames this whole thing not as some random political conflict, but as a direct act of God. It's making the point that the Lord himself is the one orchestrating this, using the Assyrian king to carry out the judgment. So after that direct statement, the language shifts. It gets incredibly symbolic, using these powerful metaphors to describe an invasion so total, it's almost like a force of nature. In verse 18, we get this wild image. The Lord is going to hiss, basically summon, two massive powers. But they're not described as armies of men. They're described as overwhelming swarms of insects. You know, that word hiss is so interesting. It's not a suggestion. It's a command. We see it used elsewhere, like in Isaiah chapter 5, and it carries this idea of an irresistible call. These nations, these insects, they don't have a choice. They have to answer. And here's the code broken down. The fly from the rivers of Egypt, that represents the kingdom to the south. And the bee, you can just imagine a swarm of angry bees. That represents the fierce military power of Assyria to the north. Both are being called into the land of Judah. And these weren't just abstract ideas. The text connects this imagery to real historical events, like the invasion by Pharaoh Necho that's mentioned later in 2 Kings. The whole point of the insect metaphor, which verse 19 expands on, is to paint a picture of an army so massive, so numerous, that they would literally cover the entire landscape. All right, if you thought the insects were intense, buckle up. We're now getting to what is maybe the most shocking and humiliating image in this whole prophecy. This isn't just about defeat. It's about total, absolute degradation. So verse 20 says the Lord will use the king of Assyria like a tool, a hired razor, to just completely strip the land and the people of everything, and to do it in the most shameful way possible. I mean, that phrase alone, it just stops you in your tracks, right? A hired razor? What in the world does that even mean? It's such a strange and specific choice of words. And here is the gut punch. The irony is just dripping from this prophecy. The very nation that Judah's king had paid, had hired with a massive tribute for protection against his enemies, is now going to be the razor hired by the Lord to shave Judah down to nothing. And according to the Benson commentary, this isn't random. Every part of this shave is symbolic. Shaving the head, that's taking out the leaders, the nobles. The hair of the feet, that's wiping out the common people. And the beard, which was a massive symbol of dignity and authority, shaving that means getting rid of the king and the high priest. It is a total wipeout of the entire social structure. And this idea of a total crushing invasion isn't a one-off metaphor. Just a chapter later, in Isaiah 8, we see it again. This time, the king of Assyria is described as a raging flood that overflows the entire country, rising all the way up to the neck, a symbol for the capital city, Jerusalem. It's relentless. So, what's left after the swarm and the shave? The final verses of this passage, 21 to 25, give us this bleak, haunting picture of what the land becomes. Now, when you first read verse 22, you might think, hey, an abundance of milk, butter, and honey, that sounds pretty good. I mean, a land of milk and honey is supposed to be a sign of blessing, right? Well, not here. Here, it means the exact opposite. Yeah, this is a classic case of things not being what they seem. This isn't a diet of prosperity, it's a diet of pure survival. People are eating butter and wild honey because there's literally nothing else. Every farm, every vineyard, it's all gone. Think about it. Verse 21 describes a man with just one young cow and two sheep. And those few animals produce tons of milk. Why? Because the human population has been so wiped out that the whole country has turned into one giant empty pasture. The few survivors are pushed back to a primitive existence, totally stripped of the corn, wine, and oil that their entire civilization was built on. And to really make you feel the scale of this loss, verse 23 throws out an economic figure. It talks about a choice vineyard, the kind that was so valuable it could pull in an annual rent of 1,000 silverlings. That's a huge amount of money. So you have these incredibly valuable, beautifully cultivated lands, the absolute pride of the nation's economy and culture. And they're gone. Verses 23 and 24 say they'll be completely abandoned, overgrown with thorns and weeds. The land goes back to being a wilderness, so wild that people have to go there with bows and arrows hunting for food, because farming is just a distant memory. And so we're left with this incredibly detailed, step-by-step prophecy of how a nation unravels, from its politics to its pastors. And it really forces you to think, doesn't it? It leaves us with this massive question about the connection between a leader's choices, a people's faith, and where a nation ultimately ends up.